Good evening. It's great to be back on live FaceTime with another bibliotherapy session. And tonight I'm going to be talking about racism, sorry about the squeaky chair, and literature that delves into racism. We're all living in a period of great concern, particularly for this topic with what's happening in America right now. And there are many ways that we can try to help. One is by educating ourselves. It's great if we sign petitions and it's great if we go on marches and make our voices heard. But also, one of the best ways to get involved is to read more about people in situations, both now and in the past, historically, who were encountering racism. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about some of the best novels that I know and the ones that I know best myself, which are on this topic. So I'd like to start with a really brilliant novel, which is actually a children's novel, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry by Mildred Taylor. And this was written in 1976, and it's about racism during the Great Depression. It's all told through the eyes of a girl, Cassie Logan, who is only 10 at the beginning of the novel. And she undergoes a whole series of really awful racist experiences, partly that happen to her when she goes to school and she's living in Mississippi, and partly that happen around her to her parents, her mum and dad, and her brothers and sisters. And this is a very impassioned and lovely, beautifully written book, which is obviously told in simpler words, being a children's book. It actually has two subsequent novels after it, which are really good as well. But I would very strongly recommend starting your reading with that book, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. Hi, Tate, Helen, and Isabel. It's great to see you. And it's really nice to have you with me here tonight. And I'd love you to send in your thoughts if you've read any brilliant books that have dealt with this topic. There's actually so many brilliant novels which I'm thinking about all the time, which deal with the topic of racism. So it's difficult to know where to start, but the best way is for me to talk about the ones that I know. So next we have a really fantastic novel, which I'm sure a lot of you will have read, The Colour Purple by Alice Walker. This is a million-selling novel, which is a coming-of-age book. It's written as a series of letters to dear God, and that's partly what makes it such an enjoyable read, because the writer, who's another young girl, Celie, is writing as if to God every night and talking about her experiences in a highly abusive family that she's living in. It's set in the deep American South between the wars, and it's about poverty, segregation, and abuse. So it's quite a tough read, it has to be said. It's not an easy one, like so many of the books that I'm going to be talking about tonight, but it is ultimately a tale of hope, and it does have a sense of great optimism despite all the terrible things that Celie goes through during her life. And it goes from when she's quite young, probably about 8, until she's a grown woman, and when she's actually managing to live her life successfully and happily. So, without giving away too many spoilers, it's a really excellent read. And The Colour Purple is a book everyone must read. Um, it is heavy, as I said before. It does have some triggering content. It does have rape and abuse. So if that puts you off, don't read it. But it is a really enlightening story written by an amazing woman, Alice Walker. And it's also written with a very poetic voice. So it's one which would inspire you, I think, to really think about the subject matter in great depth. Um, I'm going to talk a little bit about some non-fiction too. So there's a fantastic book that came out in 2014 called Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Rennie Edo Lodge, which is about the structural racism that is prevalent around us in the UK and also in the US and pretty much around the world. And that is a really brilliant book that was written initially as a blog. And then, because it was so enormously successful and popular, Rennie Edo Lodge turned the blog into a book. And it's a polemic, it's a really brilliant read, and it makes you completely reassess your own feelings about race. Helen, thank you for your comment, To Kill a Mockingbird, which you said was the first book that you read about racial prejudice and injustice. And I agree, that's a book that I wanted to mention. It's one of the first ones that I read as well about racial prejudice. And it is a book that has an amazing sense of justice. And Atticus Finch, I'm sure you'll all agree, is one of the best fathers in literature and also one of the most impressively just men in literature. And it's another book told through the eyes of a young girl. And it's also very powerful for that reason. I think this is something that is actually common to many of the books that I'm mentioning tonight, The Colour Purple and Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, and also To Kill a Mockingbird, are all books that are told through the eyes of a child, specifically a girl. And that's one of the reasons that they are so readable and so powerful and memorable. On the other hand, there are excellent novels that are written with a grown-up voice as well. This is one which many of you might know. It came out in 2018, Queenie by Candice Carty-Williams, which is another really powerful and brilliant book set in London. It's a much lighter book in a way, seemingly, than some of the other books that we've mentioned already, because some people have described it as a Black Bridget Jones's diary. Queenie is a young woman who is looking for love, and she tells her experiences as almost like a diary. And there's quite a lot of text speak within the book. You get sections like this where you can see texts being sent between her and her friends. So it's a kind of easier book to read than some of the others. But that is a superficial comment, really, because there's a hell of a lot of intense and awful things that happen in the book too. And Candice Carty-Williams describes the life of a young Black woman in London going through a lot of really awful experiences because of the prejudices of the people around her in her world of work and also in her social life. So it starts off with her trying to find a flat to live in. She's got no money, she's just been dumped by her boyfriend. And then she's also trying to better herself in the world of work. And on every turn, she does encounter prejudice in different forms. But it's actually a very funny, very, very funny book, which I did absolutely love and find hilarious. But also, through the laughter, you are experiencing enormous discomfort as you realize the prejudices that people like Queenie in this novel, have to go through. So I really strongly recommend that book, and that's a very current book, unlike some of the other books that I'm talking about this evening, which are older novels and also non-fiction. But actually, before I talk about some of the other non-fiction, I would like to mention also, hi Francis, lovely to see you here. And hi to all the other people that have recently joined. And also, by the way, Tate, thanks for mentioning The Vanishing Half, which is a book that I haven't read, so I can't comment on that yet. So I was just about to mention Kit Duvall's book, My Name is Leon, which was written in 2015. And that is a really, might have been 2016, a really wonderful book about adoption of a black boy and a white boy who are two brothers. And it goes through the horrible prejudice that they encounter, even though they are half brothers and they're living together at the beginning of the book. The people that adopt them all want to just have the white baby, not the bigger brother who's a black boy. And it's an agonizing and very uncomfortable read, really, though at the same time the characters are brilliantly drawn, and it's a really charming, lovely, excellent book to read. So that's My Name is Leon, and it's another one that's written in the voice of a child. Leon tells the story himself, and he is a really fantastic character who we are completely rooting for. It's a book that's got so much going for it and a lot of positivity in it, not least Leon getting really into gardening and finding a kind of salvation in helping someone who lives on his street to to work on his allotment. So that's a really heartening novel. And Kit Duvall has actually just brought into publication a collection of stories which are all based around the other characters in that book and in her other novel, The Trick to Time. So that's a new look on some of those characters too. But that's a book which gave me a really good insight into a different kind of racial prejudice, which went back to the 1980s in Britain. It's set in Birmingham, and that's the backdrop is with the Birmingham race riots that were going on in the 80s. Tate just mentioned Brick Lane, which I agree is a really fabulous novel, also about racism. And it's by Monica Ali, I do believe. I might be wrong. I have to check that out. It's been quite a long time since I read it. And it is a really eye-opening book as well about living in the East End as someone who I think came over from Pakistan. And that's a really great book, I agree. Another really good one to read. There's so many excellent novels, particularly often set in London. But having said that, there's of course many more from around the world and around the rest of Britain. One that's coming to mind is The Year of the Runaways, which is another really fantastic book about immigration and immigrants. And that would be one I would strongly recommend. And actually, that leads me to one of the other non-fiction titles that I wanted to mention, which is Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India by Shashi Tharoor. And that has only recently been published. It was written by a United Nations diplomat, and he has done quite a shocking expose about the colonization of India from the 18th century up to when the British left India. And that is quite an awful expose. And a really fantastic uh, piece of non-fiction as well. Thank you, Helen, for mentioning the Kit Duvall book, which is called Supporting Cast. I'd forgotten the name of that collection of stories. And that's one, I think it's not officially out until July, but it's certainly one to look out for. Now, another book I'd like to mention, which a lot of you will have heard of and might even have read, is Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. And that's the novel that won the Booker Prize, along with Margaret Atwood's The Testaments in a tie win. And Bernardine Evaristo's book is a really fluent and moving book about Black women in the UK and in America. It travels back and forth between the two, and it goes from the 1960s, I think, to the present day. And it takes many women's lives and shows us their lives from girlhood to adulthood, showing us all the many different trials and tribulations that they go through living in London, finding love, losing love, uh, finding difficult men, finding difficult women and lovely women. And it's a really fascinating expose of being Black in Britain over the last 50-year period. It also takes us to Barbados and the Caribbean. And all in all, I would really strongly recommend Bernardine Evaristo's Girl, Woman, Other, which is an excellent read. And it's one which, when you hear about it, people say it's all these different stories woven together, which might make it sound as if it's a complicated read, but it's actually not a difficult read at all. It flows from one story to the other really easily and understandably, so it's not a book that you get lost in. And I'd also like to mention Bernardine Evaristo's Mr. Loverman, which is a really fantastic novel, which I totally loved, which I don't want to give away too much about because it is one of those books that you get a revelation and it's actually a bit of a shock when it comes. But it's about a Black man who is married and has a complicated secret. He's come to the UK, he's come to London from Jamaica, and he does have secrets which I can't reveal, but I would very much urge you to read. And I think it's one that you'd all love as well. And it's not so much about race as Girl, Woman, Other, her more recent book. It's more about the many different ways of loving people. But I would so strongly recommend that too. In a discussion about race that we're having this evening, it would be madness not to mention Beloved by Toni Morrison, which is a Pulitzer Prize winning masterpiece, which some would say encapsulates the collective refracted trauma felt by slaves and their descendants. It's an amazing, incredibly powerful book, which is quite stunning in the way that it's written, but also in the story that it tells. It's actually got a lot of darkness in it and a lot of death. It talks about dead babies. There are ghosts of babies in the book. It's got a lot of blood and desecration and horror, but it also has a huge amount of love and is incredibly powerful. And it's written in such a poetic voice that it's one that you just can't resist. Angela, thank you for mentioning The Bluest Eye, which I agree is also another absolutely stunning book. Toni Morrison is one of the absolute greats, and you've got to read her if you have any desire to understand the Black experience in America, and that has to be put up there with uh, some of the James Baldwin novels and non-fiction, for instance. So James Baldwin wrote an excellent non-fiction book called The Fire Next Time, which is a classic of the civil rights movement. And it's partly written as a letter to Baldwin's 14-year-old nephew on the 100th anniversary of the abolition of slavery. And then it's also written as a kind of essay about being Black in America when he was writing. And Baldwin writes with incredible strength and passion, and at times he can seem quite dark and frightening, but he also does have an amazing optimism. And Invisible Man, thanks Angela again, is one of the most powerful novels about racism ever written, which is surreal and has mad stream of consciousness moments which take you into a almost magical realist world, but it also gets to the absolute heart of the Black experience in America. And James Baldwin, you've got to hand it to him. He is an incredible writer, and you've got to read him too. So many books that we've all got to read. There's another fantastic one, which is The Story of the Last Slave by Zora Neale Hurston. It's called Barracoon, The Story of the Last Slave, which is supposedly the story of the real last slave. Of all the millions of men transported from Africa to the Americas, he's the last man left alive. And his name was Cujo Lewis, and he was living in Alabama. And Zora Neale Hurston went to interview him, and she spent weeks and months trying to talk to him and going to visit him, taking baskets of peaches to him and trying to get him to talk, which he eventually did. And Zora Neale Hurston put his own words into her book with an amazing lyrical sense of poetry, which really literally did preserve his words. So Barracoon, The Story of the Last Slave, is another one which all of us should read. So I've mentioned Alice Walker, definitely one that you've all got to read. Queenie, that's great for the London current experience. Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, set in the Great Depression in America. Beloved, and there's one more non-fiction book which I'd like to bring to your attention, which is The Good Immigrant. 21 writers explore what it means to be Black, Asian and minority ethnic in Britain today, by Nikesh Shukla. So that is a collection of essays edited by Nikesh Shukla, and it was a crowd-funded book which was again recently published, which explores perspectives on racism in the UK. And that was very well received and very powerful and shocking. And it was so powerful that it was also eventually copied as its format in America as well. So there's now an equivalent book written in America. So that is another one that's really excellent to read and get a non-fiction perspective on racism in the UK. And of course, the American equivalent would be an excellent read. And Tate, thanks for mentioning Tiny Sunbirds Far Away, or is it Tiny Sunbirds Fly Away, by Christine Watson. That's another amazing book which all of us should read too. So Thanks so much, everyone, for giving your comments. It's really great to get your thoughts on how we can explore more and understand more about racism. I'm going to put up a post with all the names of these novels that I've been mentioning. I know that there's many more that I should have mentioned and many more that you would probably love to tell me about. So please do put more comments up here, or you can tweet me at Elabertu or email me on my email ella@elabertu.com. And I would love to hear any more ideas about excellent novels, particularly, but also non-fiction, which will help us to understand racism past and present in the UK and in America and around the world. And I'm going to be carrying on doing these sessions every Wednesday night here at 9 p.m. So see you next week. I'll put a post up before next week to say what the subject will be. Good night.